Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. This is a special live edition of our Safety Gap podcast. So, for those who don't follow it, please check it out. I'm the moderator today. My name's Cassidy Shield. I'm the CMO at RapidSOS. Welcome. We're super excited to have you here, but I'm really excited to have our guests here today. So, let me do some quick introductions and we'll get started. Deirdre Fike. Deirdre, welcome.
Thank you. And thank you for having me on today. I look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, so do we. So let me give a little bit back of your background and then feel free to elaborate. So Deidre is a former VP of Security and Investigations at MGM Resorts International and a retired FBI executive with nearly 3 decades of experience in corporate security, crisis management, and intelligent operations. Prior to MGM, she served as Chief Security Officer at Kaiser Permanente, overseeing enterprise-wide security strategy and risk management. Deidre, did I leave anything I left out on that?
No, no, other than that makes me feel really old, but thank you for that.
That makes you feel really distinguished. That's an amazing career. And we have our one and only Karin Marquez. Karin's my co-host on the podcast. She's the Chief Public Safety Brand Officer at RapidSOS. She's been here since 2018, one of the first 30 employees. Prior to that, spent many years in 911 as a dispatcher across police, fire, and EMS. Karin, how are you doing?
I am ready for the weekend. I'm great.
For those who don't know, we always open these conversations on where Karin was this week. So, Karin, where were you this week? Because you're always on the road.
This week, it was a little bit of a continuation from last week. So I went from DC, we were joining Nina 911 Goes to Washington. It was a phenomenal event. And went from there to Cal Nina. So joining all of the 911 professionals in California was another wonderful event. Just a great group of people to be with and be around and seeing all the wonderful things they're doing for their 911 communities.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Well, I appreciate everything you do. And Deidre, we appreciate you being here. So the conversation today is really to help understand kind of delays in emergency response and really kind of at the intersection of what we say is like public safety and private safety or private security. And so for those who don't know much about RapidSOS, we kind of have this interesting vantage point where we sit kind of in the middle of these two things. We support 21,000 public safety agencies, and we work with over 200 enterprise corporations. And one of the things we've noticed over the years has been kind of at times, the disconnect in communications between these two organizations. So everybody on this call, I hope and believe, is here because we want to protect and keep people safe, whether those are employees or our customers. But yet there's obviously some gaps in some of the communication, and we've noticed this from time to time. And so obviously we hear these in our conversations day in and day out with customers. But we thought we'd do a survey around this to kind of see how big of a gap this is. And so what we're going to use is they're going to use the survey as the backdrop to this conversation to kind of explore the context behind the data. And so I welcome all of you on this call to feel free to chime in the chat if you have questions as we go. We'll do some conversation here and then we'll open up for formal Q&A in about 20 minutes, 25 minutes. However, if something's burning in your mind, don't have to wait until Q&A, drop it in the chat and we'll try to pick it up as we go. So let me start by giving a little bit of background on the survey. We surveyed 300 enterprise security and safety folks across a variety of different industries. We tried to make this as professional as we could. We used multiple panels, et cetera, et cetera. Let me break down a little bit in terms of who we surveyed. So industry, company size, department, job seniority, et cetera. Hopefully all of you on this call have downloaded the survey and have read through it. And a few of the key results or key findings to kind of set up this conversation. And we're going to go through several of these to kind of tee up the conversation. So I'm not going to read all this, but I want you all to kind of digest this information as we start the conversation. And what I would love to know, and I'm going to start with you, Deirdre, is as you read this, what were your first impressions?
Well, yeah. And first of all, I want to say, just the fact that we focus on that relationship and partnership between the public and private sector is really important. And having been on both sides of it, you learn from both, whether you're in law enforcement or whether you're in the private security, that there just can't be any gaps when you're dealing with communications and working together for the safety and security of your business on the private sector side. So I really see that, most of the teams and most of the respondents are probably experiencing a lot of the same issues. And we talk a lot about, the importance of expediency in emergency notifications and how important that is. And what I find is that when there's a gap in communication, or whether your tools haven't evolved with the world that we live in now, we're behind the 8 ball to start out with. So it's really important as we look at response to 911 calls, the work that RapidSOS is doing is making it much more effective and efficient and timely for both private and private security and law enforcement to be able to do their job better. And I think that's what's really important.
And Karin, as you look through this, coming from public safety, what was your response to this? I mean, skepticism, does this feel like something that you experienced in your, in public safety, et cetera?
Yeah, I think it was certainly insightful. I think if you were to ask a lot of 911 professionals where those gaps exist, a lot of them would probably know this information anecdotally. Like, yeah, maybe we have connections and we have contacts, we have some relationships, but that's a lot more on the law enforcement side. And they're sometimes blind to how deep those relationships are, what level of contact information happens. Because once we've taken that call in and we've dispatched it over the radio, we're mostly now managing requests that are coming in from the responders that are on site. Additional resources, additional units. There's still phone calls that we are making on their behalf, but we don't always see what's happening on the ground. And so one thing that I feel that could be really improved is when we can actually get out of our centers and have the ability to go and learn and connect and understand what are those things they're doing on site? What are those levels of relationships? And how can we improve our processes to improve outcomes for all of these? We have a better chance of just having that clearer picture of the reality on the ground.
So nothing so far jumped out at you as being something you hadn't experienced. Is kind of what I take away from this conversation. So the reason I ask is, as a marketer, marketers love doing surveys, and I'm always have a healthy dose of skepticism when I see numbers like this put together. So part of the reason we're having this conversation is we can delve into the story behind the data and kind of find out what we all feel is valid and maybe not valid. So as folks on the call are looking through and reading these numbers, I'd love to hear your responses, your initial reactions. So feel free to drop those in the chat as we go. What I'd love to do now is kind of delve into particularly one of these. And so, Tom, if you can flip to the next chart. And that is this notion of, frequent delays and notifications kind of delaying then obviously the SOPs of an organization, Deirdre. So kind of your reaction to does this feel like, experience or your experience in your, with other colleagues in kind of corporate security? When you see this, how do you think about delayed reaction to emergencies?
So communications is always a challenge, no matter, in emergency situations. Things are moving so quickly. You have a lot of people involved in the incident, especially as a first responder. And so when you start having any delays, it really impacts that response and how you can resolve the situation quickly, whether it's in law enforcement, whether it's in private security, emergency management. Probably everybody will say they've experienced that is the hardest part, and the biggest challenge for leaders is how do you communicate effectively and how do you continue to improve upon that? So whether we always looked at the timeliness versus the accuracy of communications, and it's really important because those two things are very important. They're important for different reasons to different levels within your organization, but you have to find a way that you are getting that information from internal and external partners, because leaders are wanting to know what's happening right away. You don't want to be waiting to be able to provide that information. But also law enforcement, they need to respond they may not have all the information as well as us. And it takes a long time sometimes to gather the facts. And so those delays in emergency communications really have to be laid out very clearly through training, through process, policies, TTXs, SOPs, things that are consistent, and then be able to flex as needed. And some of those areas include who receives that first notice of the emergency, and then how is that communicated out? And there's so many levels of communication, up, down, across, internal stakeholders, everybody that needs to know. And a lot of times everybody thinks they need to know right away. And we really have to manage that, right? Because you have to understand who's involved in that immediate response and how do you start, being able to put your teams together to do their jobs without worrying about everybody else just wanting to know because they're interested or curious about what's going on. And, that can just be a challenge sometimes. But I will say my teams did a really great job. We had the GSOC. We worked really well. We had a great team in our operations for security operations, plus our GSOC investigations. Everybody who was working within security, we improved on it a lot. And it took a lot of time to develop those SOPs, to practice, to continue to evaluate, what goes right and wrong. And a lot of it is understanding what your leaders' expectations are. And it's really critical for you to have those conversations and be able to say, what is that expectation that it gets all the way up to your C-suite, and what do they need to know, and how quickly do they want to know it?
Yeah, one of the things we were talking about as we prepped for this is exactly that, understanding those expectations and how you communicate in, one could argue you were in one of the more complex enterprise structures or situations. So how did that evolve over time? Like, I assume a lot of the learnings come from, unfortunately, things that happen and postmortems and so forth. So I'd love to kind of hear like the inside, how you evolved that over time.
Yeah, it did. And it was, as we were just evolving our corporate security program, I mean, everything that we looked at was critical to us to continue to assess, reevaluate, identify what we needed to do to be better. And as we built that team, we realized it was important, no matter what we were doing, to have very consistent SOPs, that people were trained to those policies and processes and procedures, so there wasn't a question at the event of a crisis. And then we developed workflows for responsibilities on how to communicate out and up and who would be responsible for all of that. So, and like you said, our business was 24/7. It was changing frequently. There was no day that was the same. And it seems like the majority of those calls usually came in the middle of the night. So there were, a number of us, that were responding. We had properties around the country with different time zones. We had a 24/7 GSOC, but everybody else was also working 24/7 because of our skills, our responsibilities, and being able to respond as issues came up. And so we settled on, areas that a lot of times were manual. It's all about, that communication. And we realized initially we just all had to be getting the same information at the same time and be able to share that before we put out any formal notification. So we had a text chain with our, top leaders in our security program who were sharing information as it came in. And then as we would evaluate that, we would eventually put out a mass notification to our stakeholders, and especially, as law enforcement responded. And one of the things we talked about yesterday, because of the relationships that our security teams had with the local law enforcement, local and federal law enforcement, we had those numbers directly, and there was never a time you waited until the crisis to exchange business cards. We made sure we had those relationships developed. We had 24/7 contact information, and we were really fortunate to have just such great partners in the law enforcement community that, were immediately responsive, gave us numbers to call if we couldn't get a hold of, without having to go through 911 all the time, and make sure that the people that were in the decision-making chain were on those calls and being informed of what needed to happen.
One of the things that struck me was, despite, I'm sure, what was a lot of investment in technology and training and processes, at the end of the day, one of the ways you went about closing this gap is you physically had folks on site law enforcement is what it sounded
Yeah.
like. And then obviously you had direct connections to them and so forth. How do you know when you should do that? Like, because I assume at some point that was not the case. And then over time, you realize that should be the case. So, and just to draw a parallel, we see this in schools today as well, with SROs and so forth, where that is something that's just now emerging. So for those other enterprises out there who may not have that today, like, how did you decide that that was something that you should put in place?
Well, and I'll reiterate that we were a large organization. We are fortunate to have proprietary security in place. We had a lot of layers, which I know a lot of organizations probably don't have, and don't have the resources to be able to respond with the same, resources that we had available to us. But a lot of that, those decisions are obviously made, above my pay grade. But we would do, we analyze the incidents, the data that was coming in from our day-to-day operations. And as we evolved and we built an intelligence program, we were able to really gather a lot of data about how many incidents we were having, where were those trends, was there an increase or decrease in trends, how could we communicate that out to our security leaders across all of our property, then what changes could they make, or if we noticed a pattern that our analysts were reporting out on a weekly basis, maybe we would be working with law enforcement to say, here's a specific time and place where we need you. Can you come in and support us for this particular operation, or because we're seeing something happen that we're trying to be proactive about? And look, they were so busy all the time. I mean, it wasn't just our properties, across this, strip, mile, there was so much going on that we were mindful of their resources as well, and what was important to them to be responsive to and work together.
One of the things that I find fascinating listening to kind of the conversations that we've had and listening to the kind of the parallels with what Karin teaches me on public safety is there's a large number of parallels between how you might set up an organization at MGM and how public safety is set up. So, Karin, I'd love you to kind of elaborate on that, and as well as just what goes through the minds of 911 when you do get a call from a large enterprise or campus?
After your oh crap moment, then you can start thinking through. We have a role for every emergency, large and small, to make sure that we have the most accurate location and information to provide to our responders to keep them and the community safe. So that is asking a series of questions, but it does become a little bit more complex when it is a large scale event at a big facility where you have a lot of people. Do I have enough resources to send? And if I don't, what are my mutual aid resources that I can start requesting? And I already know it's going to take them time to get there, right? Who do I have on site? If there's weapons, what is the threat level? And because inside you're also worrying about, I am sending my people into a dangerous situation and I'm trying to be my best. So you start to kind of zero in on, am I making every decision I can possible so that they go home to their families? And so when you zone in and start to focus on, well, now I'm putting others at risk. Am I getting the right information? Do I understand the situation clearly enough? Did I give them the most appropriate information? And did I update them accordingly? And then you start to make sure, who's going to be on site coordinating that response on site. So you don't have 55 people trying to talk on the radio and give you, all of this information. And then you're kind of blind. Once they're on scene and things happen, you're kind of waiting on the radio for something else to occur, somebody to ask you a question, somebody to provide information, and then quite frankly, you're on to the next emergency because they're going to be on site for hours during a major event. You may hear from them every now and then on the radio, but we've moved on to all of the other emergencies that have not stopped. And that's sometimes the hardest or the biggest challenge for communications is that we're left in the middle of the story. We've moved on to 55 other books. And then we don't know what's happened. And these after actions occur. They may not always include that communications piece. So I may not learn what we did great, what we didn't do so great. How can we improve the next time? The law enforcement agency is going to do an after action. Do we do that in partnership with the corporate security team as well to piece all of it together? I'm not sure that we're doing that. Yes, that takes time. It takes a lot of human capital, but I think there's so many lessons that can be learned from that. And I'll say, in the 911 community, we're really grateful for telecommunicators who've experienced very large scale events that attend conferences and share with us those insights and those stories across the country so we could take those learning tips and apply them to our own independent agencies.
And I wanted to respond to something really quick to what Karin brought up that I think is critical and important to understand, and important that your leadership teams understand as well. If there's a criminal investigation going on in your organization, it belongs to law enforcement, and we assist, we provide whatever documents, records, assistance that you can from the private security, but it's their investigation, and sometimes they can't provide a lot of information to us immediately. And so that has to be messaged, because there is sometimes an expectation that, things will clear up quickly, things will go, business will go back to normal right away. And so it's different. And those who have transitioned from law enforcement, into the private sector understand, those dynamics, and have to sometimes be educating and making sure that, leadership knows when things will happen, what will happen, and in what order.
Yeah, that's great insight. This is something we've heard anecdotally, and it also showed up in the data, and I would love to get folks' response to this. And I'll start with you, Deirdre, but also those who are on the webinar, feel free to chime in. This notion that at times, as much as 50% of the time, corporate security becomes aware of an incident only when first responders show up on the scene. And I think, Deirdre, when we talked to you about this, like, because of the situation that you were in, this may not have been as big of a challenge for you, but I'd love your kind of thoughts on this in terms of when you read this, what goes through your mind in terms of your experience.
Yeah, as we when in our prep, we were talking about this, and because the way we were structured with our security teams, I don't think it happened as frequently on our properties, because we either had law enforcement present, or we had such a great presence of our security, including an emergency response team that's very visible as a proactive element of our security operations. So because they were so visible, I think a lot of times people knew to reach out to our security, or it was easier. Now, if there was a situation where 911 was called, sometimes we wouldn't know it until law enforcement responded. And because of those relationships and phone calls, a lot of times it could be verified before they had to respond if it wasn't, a high level emergency. But when they got on property right away, they knew to reach out to a manager, assistant manager, a chief on the property to find out exactly what had happened, so that we could start our actions internally right away and assist law enforcement. Sometimes we would get a report after a guest had left the organization, had checked out of the hotel, and then would wait a day or two and maybe call and report an incident that we just didn't have knowledge of because it never came into our security teams. And then we would work closely with law enforcement to go back, and you had to, kind of rewind everything and hopefully collect enough information that you could support their investigation. And that was always harder for us. Obviously, we'd like to be working jointly with a law enforcement team at the time of the incident so that we could have the best response. But we didn't have this probably as much as maybe some of the people in the survey responded. So I can kind of speak to what I was aware of, but not to those high levels.
Yeah, it's helpful. The way, if you dig into this a little bit more, the way this kind of manifests itself, and maybe why it wasn't such an issue for you, is because you have obviously security within a casino, but this usually manifests itself because when people need to call 911, they tend to not reach out to the security team or go through their landline. They tend to pick up their mobile phone and call. And we do this it's just human nature. This is how we communicate with people today. Oftentimes that call is not something that's visible to corporate security teams. But let me turn this over to you, Karin, so we can hear from you. Like, is this something that's frequented on the 911 side? Like, give us a kind of lay of the land in terms of your experience and kind of your community's experience.
Yeah, I mean, the emergency call or many calls in a large scale incident come in. We are dispatching the units that we have responsibility over and working with our partner agencies and they would be responsible for dispatching their units to an event. There is a little bit of a disconnect sometimes with the corporate security. We're on different radio frequencies, different radio types, and our responsibility is to send the law enforcement responders to that site. There are times, however, that, pick up the phone, make phone calls. Hey, there's this kind of an emergency, or we're sending a bunch of units. Can you have somebody meet and help unlock doors? Or are you seeing anything? Do you have these same reports? Trying to validate and verify the callers, what they're reporting to what might be happening on site. Or do they have any cameras that they're already looking at? Do they have suspect information? And that's all dependent on what's happening inside of that center and how many people are managing that emergency, their capability of actually picking up the phone and reaching out as well. So sometimes that doesn't happen in the first 15 seconds. It might be minutes. But if you think about law enforcement response anyway, they're not always going to be either on site at a large corporation. They're not going to be, 2 seconds away just waiting for an emergency to happen. They're dispersed within the community. They have an area of responsibility that they have. And so, in that time, there are things that can happen to make those notifications and phone calls. But right now, it is a game of telephone. It does take human capital time to reach out, sometimes to even search for those phone numbers. So I think there is a wonderful opportunity now with the evolution of technology to make a lot of these processes more automated and timely.
And I did want to add as well that one of the things, a takeaway maybe for people that are on the call, is our GSOC was actually able to monitor the metro radios. And so if there was a call coming in, a lot of times our GSOC would hear about it before the actual, operations did on a property, and could make a call over to that property's dispatch center and report, we just learned or we just heard over the radio that there was, a call that was made and law enforcement's responding to a certain location, to verify and at least give them, some heads up too if they weren't already aware of it. And that was, many times there would be notifications made because we had that information before anybody showed up, just listening to the radios.
And this might be an obvious question, Deirdre, but how impactful is it to have this information before law enforcement shows up?
Oh, incredible. And I will tell you, kind of along those lines, if somebody calls 911 directly, you've all been in casinos, you know how big they are and how confusing they are to navigate, right? And so for somebody who is calling and trying to explain where they are, or, sometimes even, just a general location, let alone a specific location, could really delay that response quite a bit. So not being able to pinpoint that somebody is in a certain location for both security and law enforcement to respond could have a critical delay on that response and resolution.
Tom, why don't we pop up the next slide? I would love to kind of quantify some of this, and then we'll move to some lessons learned. So one of the things that we often hear is, okay, there's a challenge here, but how big is this challenge in terms of the economic impact? So Deirdre, obviously I'm going to start with you. You outlined this very well when we were talking. How do you think about the things that drive this loss behind the scenes? Like, what are the things that actually make up the cost of a delayed response?
Well, for us, we really partnered well with our legal and risk management teams. And part of that, over time is we developed these, just direct, integrated relationships, because they will always look at something different than security does. But if we don't understand that and don't know how to respond to their needs, it's going to cost the organization eventually down the line. So as we worked really closely with our risk management team, we found that when we could be more proactive, we could understand what are the areas that they are getting, legal actions on or feedback on, and really be more in a preventive mode than reactive. It helped everybody across that organization. And so we started presenting on behalf of our risk management teams to underwriters when they would have their big conferences, to let them know, here's the actions that we're taking to prevent anything going wrong on the properties, any criminal activity, anything internally. And that has led to us having a decrease in certain types of incidents and a better response. And so that adds up. Security, as everybody knows, is not a ROI business. And so we really have to look at how do we explain where we add value. And when you can do that through your risk management teams, then that starts equating into saving the organization money, either through insurance policies or things that we can do that are having a effect on brand reputation, where more customers, more clients want to be there and do their business there, because we are already advertising and marketing how we are more secure because of these actions that our teams are taking.
Yeah. So what I found interesting about this study is there's certain industries where this is cost of downtime, inability to kind of ship or produce goods. So that's real tangible costs. And from your perspective, what I'm understanding when you think about risk and legal involved, it's brand reputation, it's like traffic flow, it's probably lawsuits, etc. To the point where I think you mentioned one of the first folks to get notified now is risk management. Is that fair?
Yeah. As soon as we had an incident, they always have people on their properties too. So in addition to their corporate organization that worked closely with our corporate security, they had, risk management teams on their property too, working with our security teams. So if something happened, they could immediately work side by side by our security team to make sure everything was being gathered that was important to them. If they were to get a complaint in later on, or something would happen where there was a challenge to an incident. And a lot of times they would just see things differently. For an example, instead of focusing specifically on the incident and that time and place, what we realized is you have to go backwards, right? What happened prior to that incident? What happened after that incident? And then you put that whole story together. It tells a much more, clear, precise story of what was happening at the time of, a certain incident. So we worked together a lot so that there was a lot more information for them to bring to, the table when they were in negotiations and they had to, resolve an issue.
I have a variety of more questions. I want to move to lessons learned, but why don't we start opening up for Q&A? Let's go first to you, Deirdre, but then I'll go to you, Karin. So a simple change that could have been made to avoid delays during a major incident.
I will say some of our lessons learned on this is we make sure you maintain hard copies of contacts for everybody, and that those are updated on a regular basis, because as you have turnover and you have new employees entering their roles in a large organization, that can change on a weekly basis. And so we had a cybersecurity incident that happened while we were there. And we realized how reliant we'd become on everything being in our computers, digital information, and that we needed to make sure that we had all of that in an area where it was easily accessible, and that we had updated contact information, not just work numbers and office numbers, but personal numbers, for our executives, where we could actually reach out and have, make notifications without having our digital process to do that, our notification system.
One of the things I remember you mentioning in this idea of like keeping contact information updated is that there seemed to be an encouragement to just have relationships with local law enforcement, go to lunch,
Absolutely.
meet up. Obviously, I'm sure you're doing training together every once in a while.
Right.
But it was interesting, the human component of this, of not just having it being a transactional relationship. It was something where everybody got to know each other. I thought that was quite fascinating. Anything you want to elaborate on that?
Well, I would just say that, as the command turned over for, our areas on the strip, and people were promoted, or you had, different leadership come in, we always made it a point to have lunch, get to know each other, make sure we had that contact information, make sure they could contact us day or night, 24/7. And because we had developed trust with each other and had not just, the working relationships, but personal relationships, it made it much easier to be successful. Look, in security, we always say that whether it's a competitor or whether, you're working with law enforcement, when it comes to security and safety, everybody's on the same page, right?
Yeah.
Everybody wants the same thing at the end of the day. And when we hosted, the NFL draft, we hosted the Stanley Cup, we hosted the Super Bowl, we had incredible relationships with NHL, NFL, and to that point where, you just trusted each other because you needed to pass information on as quickly as possible if there was any sort of issue that needed to be handled or investigated. So across the board, I would say that, we were just very fortunate, and everybody understood that was probably one of the greatest areas to success. And, everybody did that. I know our teams were incredible with that.
Yeah, I love that answer. I mean, despite all the technology around us, oftentimes it does come down to personal relationships and trust. So that's beautiful.
Exactly.
Karin, maybe I'll ask you the same question here. Anything that you've experienced, any simple change that would make a difference in a major incident you might have handled in the past?
Yeah, bringing all of the stakeholders together. So oftentimes when after actions or debriefs occur, the 911 community may not always be at the table. And if they do happen with a GSOC, still there may not be all of the stakeholders. And so it's really important to learn what the challenges were during these large incidents and then reflect on okay, here's our role. So 911 and the field responders have very specific and unique roles, but all of it works hand in hand. And so what information did we have, or could we have had, or what could we have asked in order to have improved an outcome for this case? So I think just that inclusion. So, don't wait for field responder agencies to build a relationship with you. Get out there and build relationships with them too. Sometimes it's just reaching across and shaking the hand and say, hey, we want to learn more because we want to figure out ways that we can do better and support our communities better as well in partnership with you. And then, staffing is an issue. So you may not always be able to go to, scenarios, tabletops, events, but whenever there are those scenarios and we're training together and learning together, really take the time to send folks or give a virtual option so that people can attend, listen, and learn. It's all about, again, those relationships lead to understanding and awareness, and those learning opportunities help us be better next time.
And Karin, I want to kind of jump off on that too. I'm glad you mentioned tabletop exercises because it's so critical to be able to run through scenarios because you identify so many areas where somebody has one responsibility or thinks somebody else is doing it, or, what can happen in a crisis situation. And so, when we were working through those, we would start at, your first level of, leadership across every one of our properties, because everybody's going to be a little bit different, based on what they have in their property, whether they had, entertainment, whether they had, what all was their marketing, whether they hosted conventions. And then as we worked up, and we would go, have TTXs with our team. We did them with our risk management team, and we did them with our C-suite. But also we would practice TTXs with our law enforcement. Usually if there was a big incident, they would host one and invite, the private sector security leaders to be a part of that. And it was just invaluable. We were embedded a lot of times together. So if there was a big event happening, we would have law enforcement sitting side by side by people in the private sector. So that information was being shared immediately and directly.
That's great. So Deirdre and Karin, we have a few in the chat. I want to handle some of these. I'm going to go first to Kevin. Would be curious if either of the panelists could address how they share important safety info with meeting planners in large meeting and convention centers, if they have any commentary. In several circumstances where significant safety security events have occurred at large meeting facilities, conference attendees turn to meeting planners on what they should do, as typically the security department may be overwhelmed in a significant event. So maybe I'll direct that to you, Deirdre, first, and then there's a question here of does RapidSOS have a feature that could help with this? I'll direct that one to Karin afterward.
So when it came to large events and, conventions or, sports events or anything else happening, we actually had specific training for our security teams who handled those events. And so in addition, all of our security officers went through a 3-week training academy, which was held at MGM Resorts. Like I said, they were proprietary. They were all MGM employees. So we had the fortunate, luxury of having standardization and processes. But then there were also certain security teams that worked specifically on those events, maybe had to have Safety Act training in addition to whatever else that they were handling on a regular casino property, and then how to actually respond to situations, especially you have, celebrities come in, you have a lot of high level guests that are coming in. We started having the Formula One, at Las Vegas, that was the first year we had done that 2 years ago. So there were different needs for those security events. And so we made sure that the teams that were responsible for that had that specific training and could respond and work with law enforcement directly, as well as their security teams on what needed to be done.
I love that. Kevin, do you want to elaborate on that? I see that you're able to talk if you'd like to. No pressure.
First of all, it was nice to see you, Deirdre, there. I worked with you here in Los Angeles before we both retired. So congratulations on your part B of your life. I work specifically in the meeting and event industry, and that's what that question was that I asked, and realized that your property, talk about top notch, been there several times, but a lot of times it's other facilities, convention centers, large hotels with convention centers. And when significant issues have impacted outside a meeting or convention area or large meeting rooms, sometimes there's no communication with the meeting planners, right? And because the security teams are completely overwhelmed going to the event. And just wondering if there's been anything that either of you have worked with, and even with RapidSOS, where meeting planners could sign up, where information could be pushed out to meeting planners that was applicable to tell folks if there's an evacuation, go this way or that way, when there's a lack of security personnel because of the event is overwhelming, right? Because everyone's going to the threat. I've seen that several times in trying to work with meeting planners and working with the security teams at these events, saying, is there a notification process that we could get on our phones or do when again, you have an event with 1,000 people, 500 people, it's nice to be able to have that when the information could be shared, that could be very vital to getting people in the right direction. That's it.
I appreciate that, Kevin. Karen, is there anything you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I can kind of start from the 911 perspective. We do have the ability to notify people in the event of an emergency. Typically, we're drawing a polygon or an area in which we're going to send that notification out to every mobile device within that area. Those things do take a little bit of time. I think from signing up for a specific event in a specific facility, that may sometimes be more on the GSOC side. I'm not positive, so Deirdre, I'd ask for your expertise on that. I would say also for these meeting facilities, conference facilities, and for meeting planners, you can always build a relationship with your 911 center as well. So if you're already working with law enforcement, understand what can we do? Do I have to pick up the phone and call? If I'm not able to call, does your agency have text to 911? If I have videos or images, not every 911 center across the country right now is using video yet, but we know that with next generation 911, that is happening. Those are kind of things that RapidSOS can help with today, where we have the ability to receive video from devices. We have the ability to text out, and we have other features as well. But really, there's a public education arm of almost every 911 community across the country where you can engage with them, bring them to talk to your corporate. We do this in school all the time. We go out and we teach kids how to dial 911. But there are other levels where we can be, more in our community. I know we used to go to all of the events that happened across the city, and, always educating people on how to reach out and interact with 911. So that's specifically to kind of us. But always, if you're already working with law enforcement, ask them, get introductions. They can always bring that 911 information out to the community as well. And then Deirdre, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, and an area that I hadn't touched on yet is we actually had a very experienced security events manager, and he had come up through the organization, had been with them for a long time, and focused primarily on event security. So anytime there was something happening on one of our properties, he coordinated directly with the law enforcement's event security team that would be, who had been longstanding in there, and they were connected at the hip, and he knew everybody that was planning an event at any of our properties and would be present there. And we always had action plans developed prior to the event. So everybody, would contribute. For New Year's Eve, as an example, with, 1 million people coming to the Strip, there was always every one of our properties had to develop an action plan that then we put together and had it in place if something should happen. So everybody knew exactly what was happening and what to do if there was any sort of incident. So that going back to being proactive is so important, because you can't react to everything. You can't, anticipate everything that's going to happen, but being proactive, having it in writing, having a document that shows what your action plan is, and then your emergency response plan, and then being able to follow that, train to it, and tabletop it, before an actual event is really important for a lot of reasons in an organization.
I know we're running up against time. I'm going to add on to this topic. Michael Shear asked this question around, the major casinos in Las Vegas run joint drills across, I think what he means, GSOCs of those casinos, as well as local law enforcement. How often do you get together and do that, and then how often?
It happened pretty frequently because of all the events that were taking place. So anytime that there was going to be a major event that impacted the entire Strip, we were there with our competitor properties, with law enforcement, with our GSOC, with, the 911 centers. I mean, anybody who would have a potential response to an emergency would train together and have a tabletop. And it was hosted by Las Vegas Metropolitan Police. We came in, it was handled professionally, but there was an opportunity to really share information and talk about what are the threats. Does anybody know what is out there currently? What is the current threat situation, so that we could focus on that and then share that information prior to the incident. Yeah,
that's great. I mean, as someone who used to frequent Las Vegas quite a bit in my younger days, I'm certainly happy that happens. All right, so I'm going to come to you, Karin, with some parting thoughts, and then Deirdre will give you the last word. Karin, I'm going to weave this into the one last question. What is the biggest challenge for 911 and first responders in sharing information with corporate security teams, or what is missing? So maybe answer that, and then any other parting lessons learned that you want to share with the audience.
Yeah, I think back to Deirdre's point in understanding this is law enforcement. Whenever there's a crime that's committed, they have to be very thoughtful about what they can share and how. From the 911 perspective, sometimes information is coming so quickly from so many different people that it's hard to put those pieces of the puzzle together quickly and most accurately to those field responders. Not all information is given within the first few seconds or minutes of an incident. Sometimes people go home, they leave, and then they call later, and they may have critical information to give. You're like, well, I wish I would have had that 10 minutes ago. That would have really helped. So, sometimes just the things happen so quickly that you do your best, and there's still opportunities to do better next time. So I will just say that training, building those relationships. I love learning from agencies like Las Vegas and other, large areas. I know in Texas, they work very closely with, in Arizona, with some of their larger GSOCs. Silicon Valley, those 911 communities are working really well with them. For those of us that are more in that mid-size 911 center, that we may not be able to work with them as closely or know them. I think there's some great takeaways just from this chat, learning from you, Deirdre, and others, where we can start taking some steps to just create that awareness and start to bridge some of those relationships. And I always ask the 911 folks, sit around the room with your people and just say, if this happened right now, what would you do? And start brainstorming together.
I love that. And thank you, Karin. Deirdre, any parting thoughts, any lessons learned that you want to share that you haven't had a chance to say?
Well, just in generality, I think it's really important. I mean, everybody in security needs to understand what is their business about. Because if you can't speak to the business, you're not going to be able to do your job effectively, right? Because our security world is different than usually what, the business of your organization is. So you need to be, make sure you understand professionally how does security contribute to the business, and what is it that they want from from you. And like Cassidy, you said, if you're in Las Vegas, we don't want anybody to even know we're there, right? I mean, if you can have a good time and you're at a property and you're enjoying yourself, you don't have to worry about anything. That's our goal. So you want to make sure that you can develop your vision and align your goals with what your business is. Ours was very much customer service. And so we knew not only were we security, but we had to be in the customer service industry and be able to help people when something wasn't just going wrong, but just on an everyday, day-to-day job, and what our security teams did. And that was really important. And I can't tell you how many times they saved lives because everybody was CPR trained. I mean, it was amazing the stories that you would hear about them being able to save somebody's life. So those things need to get that out. People need to understand that's happening behind the scenes. And then if you're looking to implement more technology that is going to make you more efficient, more effective, sometimes it takes a while. So collect that data, be able to analyze it, be able to interpret it on why that's important for your business, and then develop a plan on how that can be implemented to save the organization time, money overall, and just make you much more effective as a security team.
Great answer. And I have to say, you must be doing something right because I always feel safe in Las Vegas, which is ironic given the number of people that visit the city every day and every year.
That's the highest compliment.
Well, Karin and Deirdre, thank you for joining, and thank you all for participating in this live event. It looks like in the chat you can get access to the report if you haven't read it already, so I encourage you all to do that. Otherwise, thank you for your time and have a great day.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of The Safety Gap. This podcast is powered by RapidSOS, where we're dedicated to closing the safety gap through intelligent safety technology. If you're passionate about creating a safer, smarter world, be sure to follow The Safety Gap wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. For more information and to catch up on past episodes, visit us at rapidsos.com.